Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa McClenahan, Executive Director and Counsel at the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Walkerton's Drinking Water Protection Legacy. In this series, we commemorate the 20th anniversary of the contamination of Walkerton's water supply by speaking with the people who experienced the tragedy and the inquiry that followed firsthand. With me today is Jim Smith. Jim is a former Assistant Deputy Minister at the Ministry of the Environment in Ontario and was Ontario's first Chief Drinking Water Inspector. He has over 30 years of experience in environmental standard setting and program and policy development. Jim led the team creating the drinking water regulation immediately after the Walkerton tragedy. Jim is a Fuller Award winner and received the Sandra Lang Career Achievement Award for Public Service. Jim is now the chair of the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you, Teresa.
So you became Ontario's first official Chief Drinking Water Inspector, a role that was established as a result of the Walkerton inquiry. Why did you think it was important to take on that role at that time?
Well, I took on that role in the summer of 2003, and I want to give you a little bit of context to that. So if we go back to the summer of 2000, during the Walkerton tragedy, the government had a major response to that, of course, securing the water supply in Walkerton, and also immediately looking at the current the regulations of the day. And I was asked to lead a team of experts to look at how can we make that regulation better, what was broken. Right. And we worked day and night in doing that. There was a small team of experts dedicated to the cause. So that was my first sort of work in the area. And as you can imagine, between 2000 and 2003, there was a lot of government attention to Walkerton. Right. There was the Justice O'Connor inquiry, 2 reports, as you know, in 2002, 121 recommendations. So those recommendations set, in essence, the template for what the province would need to do. And in 2003, they advertised a position, joint position of ADM, as you mentioned, and Chief Drinking Water Inspector. And I applied for that. I was motivated by the work I'd done in terms of the regulatory changes, and also motivated by the fact I wanted to contribute to the province. There were 3 tasks involved for that position. One was creating the organizational capacity to implement the 121 recommendations. Second one was to restore trust and confidence in drinking water in Ontario. And the third was to ensure Ontario was top in the world in terms of how it delivered safe drinking water. So those were the factors that led me to taking on that responsibility. It was an appointment. I had to go through a competition, and I was also motivated. It was always a personal desire of mine since graduating at Queen's back in the late 70s in engineering to have my career in drinking water. So the way of fulfilling that.
That's great. That's great. And rebuilding trust was absolutely one of the essential things that I know the community at Walkerton spoke to us about in the early days, and remains one of the important legacies from their perspective as well. So Jim, you were involved as the Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Drinking Water Inspector in establishing Ontario's drinking water safety net, which is a multi-barrier approach to protecting much of Ontario's municipal drinking water. What are your recollections about working to establish those protections? What did you think were the most critical things to put in place after the Walkerton events and the tragedy that followed?
What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my role when I first took on the position. So I became ADM and Chief Drinking Water Inspector in July of 2003. And that was with a division of 1 person, myself. We By January, and remember the date, January 26th, 2004, we had a division of 300 people. So it was about bringing in the capacity to implement the 121 recommendations and have the appropriate structure and leadership. And what was the challenge at the time was, one, to ensure the inspections were taking place. Absolutely important to regain confidence that well over 600 municipal drinking water systems needed to have thorough inspections undertaken. And the second, of course, was to ensure that we had a source to tap framework for protecting Ontario drinking water. The role of the role I had as ADM, Assistant Deputy Minister, was of course to lead the organization so that can be done. And I should note that in taking the position, the government was absolutely committed, steadfastly committed to ensuring the resources were there and that the progress that was being made would be supported as well in a fairly rapid way in government. As ADM, I was also responsible for ensuring that we could deliver upon the recommendations, that the reporting systems were in place and that the infrastructure was there to capture all this information on water quality that we were collecting through monitoring and through our inspection process. The 121 recommendations, large task, as you can imagine. And what we did was we developed, as you noted, a framework for stakeholders. And we called it at that point the Drinking Water Safety Net. And that consisted of a number of fundamental pieces. The source to tap legislative framework is one. Timely and reliable testing, a second. A third was very fast responses to any drinking water issues and their resolution.
Right.
Fourth was reporting, and there were a number of other elements. Now, I should note that framework is still in place today. Terminology has changed a little. I think it's called the Drinking Water Protection Framework now. But a fundamental there were the requirement to report on an annual basis. And that was the role of the Chief Drinking Water Inspector in this split position. So every year, the inspector was responsible by statute to develop a report for the minister that is then made public. What's important there is the accountability and the transparency, so that Ontario's water quality and the status of its drinking water supplies was provided to the public. And I believe last year the 15th annual report was published. The other role of the Chief Drinking Water Inspector was to go out there to stakeholders, municipalities, and other owners of drinking water supplies and partners in drinking water, and ensure they had confidence in the system and also understood what the rules were. So it was a focal point of one person they could look towards.
Right.
In terms of some other notable accomplishments, when you have 600 plus drinking water systems in the province, how do you manage all that information? And in the second report that came out, we provided a report card on municipalities, basically taking hundreds of inspection findings per drinking water system and coming up with a grade, anywhere from 0 to 100%. And it allowed municipalities to focus on high achievement. It was transparent. I hear even today municipalities feel it's been a very important tool for them to show the public that they're doing a great job in drinking water safety. I guess there's one other part I wanted to talk about. Lots of things we can talk about, obviously, and we talked about trust and confidence. And in 2005, I was asked to lead a team to go to Kasheshawan, First Nation community in Kasheshawan. Chief Leo Friday, asked the Ontario government if they could come up to his community and do an assessment of their water supply. And I did that. It received front page news in the Toronto Star, given it was a key issue of the day. But for me personally, it showed that one, there was trust in what we were doing, and secondly, we were capable of doing it. So I'm certainly proud of that report and that work.
Right, right. And as you say, the component of trust and the elements of accountability and oversight were key recommendations of the Justice O'Connor report. And so I think everyone in Ontario is grateful for that work that you did, Jim, in making sure that all of the recommendations were actually acted on and implemented, which is a rare thing in terms of any inquiry. So then you
wanted to add there,
go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to add again, in terms of that position, given that's what we're focusing on, I credit Justice O'Connor in terms of his comprehensiveness and understanding of how do you make recommendations that have a legacy and ensure accountability and transparency. So he, in his recommendations, identified the need for a chief drinking water inspector in the statute. He also identified the need for an organization that's dedicated to drinking water. And it was his foresight that is still in play today.
Right,
so
right.
That was important to note.
Right. And so another recommendation he made led to the establishment of the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council. And you became and are the second chair of the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council. That council provides independent advice to the Minister of the Environment about drinking water. Why did you think it was important to now take on that role, and how does it help to protect drinking water?
So again, as my response to your first two questions, there's a professional and personal side to that answer. So I am retired, and after Jim Merritt, the first chair, stepped down, the government asked me if I would be interested in such an appointment. So I thought, one, it would be a way of applying my talents and experience to a council that I supported in my day as ADM and Chief Drinking Water Inspector. It's a council of 10 experts from Ontario, broad representation, individuals from academia, from municipal drinking water systems, from the consulting world, all with in public health, all with their expertise that they're bringing to the table to provide independent advice, and again, in a framework of checks and balances to look at what's happening in drinking water, primarily on standards, but also on any drinking water issue or policy matter, and look at it from through an independent lens, and provide that advice to the minister. In terms of our membership, we just had a member that was awarded the highest honor in drinking water, the Fuller Award, Ian Douglas from the city of Ottawa. So that speaks to the caliber of individuals we have. In terms of the work we're doing, it's looking at some of the major standards of the day. So a couple of examples, we're looking at lead. Health Canada last year has revised the Canadian drinking water guideline for lead. It's more stringent now. We're actively looking at how is that standard implemented in Ontario, with the fortunate circumstance of Ontario being a leader in Canada on lead reduction in drinking water. So tremendous effort over the last 10 years by the province. And it's how do you make that system continuously improve towards this new standard, and that's what we're looking at. We're also working on a set of chemicals that have come to the attention of agencies in the last decade or so. They're polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, and they're in firefighting foams, and various consumer products. The issue with them is they're, one, ubiquitous at very low levels, and secondly, very persistent. And the Ontario government, the Ministry of the Environment, is currently looking at those and developing new drinking water guidance. And so we're looking at that. In terms of the policy side, the ministry is updating its treatment requirements for municipal systems that have groundwater and surface water as their sources. So a very comprehensive update, and we're looking at that. In terms of our role, yes, we are an independent advisory council for the minister. But again, in terms of transparency and accountability, we do have our own website. As chair, I publish an annual statement. It provides our activities for the year. And we also publish our minutes so that they're public. I think that's an important cornerstone of how we operate and part of the overall commitment to drinking water safety. In my first statement as chair of the council, I did talk about the need for vigilance. I think one of the problems we have to combat is complacency. The only way you can do that is continued vigilance. And I know the council isn't the council of the 10 individuals I have right now committed to do that. We meet every 6 weeks or so, and a commitment to ensuring the minister does have the best advice possible in moving forward on drinking water. So that's the council.
Right.
I did want to just say at the end, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. And I am a fan of SELA's. You've been steadfast in your support in environmental policy and in drinking water in particular. On lead, I was going to note, we did do a webinar with you, the council, the ministry, led by SELA. I thought it was a great next step for lead and communicating it to the public. So thank you.
That's great. Right. And the Ministry of the Environment joined us in that webinar as well, which was a great service to the public and to the community to bring accurate information. Thank you for those comments, Jim. And thank you very much for agreeing to be part of our series. This interview is one of a short series titled Walkerton's Drinking Water Protection Legacy, curated by SELA, to be housed on the SELA Foundation's environmental history pages. In this series, we focus on the essential lessons learned from one of our significant SELA cases, the Walkerton Inquiry, and how to ensure drinking water protection and environmental protection is safeguarded into the future. Jim Smith was responsible for much of the regulatory and program implementation of the response to the tragedy when he was at the Ministry of the Environment. He was the first Chief Drinking Water Inspector and is now Chair of the Ontario Drinking Water Advisory Council. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.